We pick up in 29 of Genesis, and we see that God is present in the development of his plan. We know that he has a plan, but he's also present in making sure that plan develops and is accomplished. And so the idea here is that we need to let him lead. Jacob didn't do that. Jacob was deceitful, manipulative. He was always looking to be blessed, but God was present to accomplish his plan. All of the things in Jacob's life were developing him to be able to recognize God's presence. Moment by moment, he wasn't. But as a big snapshot, when Jacob looks back over the many years, we see in chapter 35 that he says, it was God all along who was present. And God is developing all of these things in Jacob's life to get him to recognize that. So Jacob continues on his journey. He meets Rachel, Laban's daughter, and he immediately falls in love. So he goes to Laban, and Laban says, yeah, you can have her. Work for me for 7 years, and then you can have her. And Jacob does it. But at the end of the 7 years, Laban tricks Jacob. And on the night that he thought he was getting Rachel, under the cover of darkness, Laban gives him the eldest daughter, Leah. Deceit runs in the family, apparently. Jacob did not like being tricked. He was always the trickster. And now he just got tricked. Not a big fan of that. So there's tension already. But Jacob says, I'm so in love with her, I want her. Laban says, work another 7 years and I'll give her to you. And so he does. So after all of that, Jacob takes 2 more wives. So he has 4 total. We already established at the beginning of Genesis, what's God's plan for marriage? 1 wife. God didn't suddenly say, take as many as you want. I'm just so generous. 1 wife, right? They're breaking God's command. But he takes 4 total wives, and he has 12 sons and 1 daughter. At the end of chapter 30, Jacob and Laban are battling over flocks and possessions, and there was a lot of prosperity there. Jacob appears to have won in this battle of arguments and raising flocks and healthy animals and things like that. But it wasn't because Jacob was smarter. It wasn't because Jacob had more cunning than anyone else. It was because God is a God of grace, and he was present in the development of that plan. And every success that Jacob saw wasn't because he was such a wonderful servant of God. It was because God develops his plan, and God is a God of grace. And so Jacob has more opportunities to see, I need to let God lead because God is present in my life. So even in the midst of all of the family chaos with the deception from Laban, the trickery from Jacob, the multiple wives, and those wives giving Jacob their servants as more wives, so we have 4 different mothers to 12 different boys, God was still present and developing his plan in the life of Jacob. Leah, the unloved wife, has half of those sons, including the priestly line of Levi and the messianic line of Judah. God is a God of grace. He is present in all of that. R.C. Sproul says this, Jacob experiences the blessing of divine providence in meeting Rachel, and in a bitter irony, the deceiver becomes the deceived. So behind the 2 scenes, the gracious and just hand of the sovereign God, who works all things according to his purpose and who promised to be with Jacob, can be discerned. God is there. He is present. He doesn't abandon his plan. He doesn't leave so that it develops on his own. He is intentional. And we must let him lead. When we don't take the time to recognize that it is because of the hand of God, then it's easy to convince ourselves of happenstance or luck, right? Was it a stroke of luck that Jacob magically saw Rachel in the middle of the day when no one goes to water because it's too hot? No, it wasn't luck. It was God's sovereignty in the plan that he's developing. He was present, and he's present in your development too. He's present in your life. He is responsible for his plan, and he has a plan for you, and we need to let him lead. We certainly can't run, and we definitely need to let him lead. So then the story of Jacob continues in chapters 31 and 32. And we see that God is present in your correction and we need to cling to him. Now, Jacob is still a man of lying and deceit, and God has to do something to get his attention. Has anyone ever been in a point of their life where God had to do something to get your attention? And it was something that you really didn't want to go through. Anybody? We've all been through some big things, and we know that God is working, but it's a miserable experience. Jacob needed something to just slap him and say, stop serving yourself and serve God. Make God yours. God's going to do that. But even in the midst of all that correction, we see that God is present. So chapter 31 tells us the story of Jacob fleeing Laban secretly with his wives and children. However, this also was the guidance and presence of God, because do you remember God's promise in verse 15 of chapter 28? What does he say to Jacob? You may be running, but what am I going to do? I'm going to bring you back to this land. So the situation got so bad because of Jacob and his rejection of just every help, but God used it to say, you're coming back now. I'm bringing you back to this land. And so God is fulfilling that promise. God remains faithful to that promise, even though Jacob was a schemer, and he continued that. And we even see in chapter 31 that there were pagan idols present in the household. So not only did Jacob not officially say, God, you are my God, he was also allowing, we don't know worshiping for sure, but he was allowing pagan idols in his household. And God is still present. He is still working on him. In verse 5 of chapter 31, we see that Jacob is softening to the presence of God when he says, but the God of my father has been with me. And we see for the first time that Jacob acknowledges that it's still the God of his father, but he recognizes his presence. And we see a softening in Jacob. And in the next few chapters, we're suddenly going to see a brand new person, because God is pursuing him. God is present. We heard last night from Pastor Derek. He was so genuine. And he said he's not a great kid, rejected the ways of the Lord, and all it took was one person to just invite him to a Bible study. God was present, softened his heart, brought him to a point of realizing that he needed Jesus as his Savior. We see a softening in Jacob in chapter 31. And we see this recognition of God's presence continue to grow as he runs, as he goes back to where God has called him. And God is using all of this mess, all of this stuff that's happening with family to bring Jacob to a point of humility. You see, all of this correction is part of God's plan, and he uses it to accomplish his glory, his purpose. But to finally put an end to the pursuit that Jacob had of himself and his own plan, we see one of the strangest stories in Scripture. Jacob wrestling with God. And this may have a lot of question for you, and I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. But what we see is that Jacob, as he is fearing Esau, as he is running, he knows that Laban is chasing him from behind, and he knows that he's headed towards Esau, who has 400 men. And the last thing that Jacob wants is a busy night. He wants rest. He wants peace. He wants to wrap his mind around running from an enemy and pursuing his brother who wants to kill him. But God has different plans, and God suddenly engages Jacob in a wrestling match. This is a physical person that Jacob wrestles. It's a tangible, visible manifestation of God himself that engages Jacob in a wrestling match. You can understand the symbolism here. As each one of us struggles with self, and we know the desires that we have, and we wrestle and we say, but I want to do what's right, but I don't know how to do what's right, and it's this back and forth, and Jacob is wrestling because he is a man of self. I will win. I will lie my way out of anything. I will deceive you to get whatever I want, and God is wrestling him all night long, physically exhausting him. Now, don't think that Jacob's strength is that of God's, and so it took God all night long to wrestle Jacob. No. God matched Jacob's strength and knew that it was going to take all night to wear him down to a point of humility where he says, I can't do it anymore. And suddenly, at the end, God touches Jacob. Now, the word is touch. This word does not mean that God suddenly used some magical power and just barely went boop and dislocated his hip. This is an act of strike, if you look that word up. It's a strike, and God showed that I am stronger. You will not beat me, Jacob. And he brings him to a point where the only response that Jacob has is to cling to God. He realizes he can't win. And all he can do is cling to him. God even says, let me go in verse 26. And Jacob says, I will not let you go until you bless me. Now, of course, Jacob wants another blessing, right? But what's different about this one is Jacob recognizes that it is God who blesses, and he can't do anything about it. He can't lie. He can't trick to get this blessing. All he can do is just cling to God and say, I'm not letting go because it is you alone who blesses me. And what we see in verse 27 of chapter 32 is an amazing look at the gospel, because God asks Jacob, what is your name? And Jacob is presented with an opportunity to own it or to lie. And everything up to this point was Jacob lies about everything. But Jacob owns it, and he says, I know all I can do is cling to God, and I'm going to be honest for the first time, and I'm going to say, my name is Jacob. And by pronouncing his name, it reminds him that it means heel grabber. It means deceiver. It means that his whole life, all he's done is live up to this stupid name, and he needs something different. He needs to just cling to God. And God rewards that humility, and he says, all right, I'm going to change your name. Because finally you understand that it is not you. It is not you living up to what everyone expects of you. It is you finally coming to a point of saying, I'm laying it all down, and all I can do is cling to God. And so God promises to name him Israel, which means wrestles with God. And so for us, we have to remember we can't lie or deceive our way into the blessings of God. We must recognize that God is present in our correction, and we must stop fighting him. We need to stop clinging to who we were or what you've done and realize that all you can do is just cling to God, and you can do that because of Jesus Christ, who went to the cross for you. Just as Jacob receives a new name that's called Israel and a brand new identity, you too in Jesus Christ can be made new.